Well, having had the experience in the bookstore when I was at Principia, one of the things that I could do, I thought at that time, was to work in a bookstore, and I did so apply. The bookstore was the outstanding bookstore in the Midwest, and the kind of funny part of that experience was Bob Sutherland, who was the manager of the book department, was extremely careful about how everything ran. Well, I'd been assistant manager of a bookstore, for heaven's sakes, so I thought I knew something about books and so forth. But I got told in no uncertain terms I was not to move a book, I was not to develop a display, I was not to do any of these things. And Bob Sutherland scared the daylights out of me, so I became pretty laid out almost in what I was doing there in the bookstore. And it was during that time that I took those two crazy classes that subsequently were deleted from my my transcripts because I got C's and D's in life drawing and American civilization and French. But they enabled me to complete a master's degree in 18 months. It was where my wonderful and long-term friend, Dr. William Eller, became such a force in my life. He said, why aren't you in education? And I said, well, I haven't had any education classes. At Prin, they'd figured out that they'd call it human relations because I'd had all this polyglot of courses when I was at the University of Washington, and they didn't know what to do with me. So they just sketched this thing together and called it human relations, and it was the only time I think anybody ever took it as a major. But it enabled me to finish a master's in 18 months, and Bill Eller had me as supervisor of the clinic there in Iowa, and that enabled me for him to say that I had finished my student teaching experience. I never had student teaching. I was able to go into a classroom and have a wonderful second grade experience in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with a master's in elementary education and a certificate for teaching and no student teaching, because Bill said he didn't want me to get messed up. So anyway, I had a wonderful 1962 to 63 year as a second grade teacher. And it was from that second grade experience that Hale Reed, who became another force in my life, asked if I would coordinate what became one of the 27 U.S. Office of Education first grade studies. It was a national effort to identify the most successful means for teaching reading. And one of the chapters in my book, actually two of the chapters in my book M2IP3, are devoted to the follow-up studies of that first and second grade experience. So I coordinated those two studies from 1964 to 1966. And it was at that point that Bill Eller then, who had subsequently moved to Buffalo, said, would I come and coordinate the U.S. Office of Ed study that he and Don Brown were directing. He said there's no research being done in adult literacy. It's pitiful. They had gone to a conference. He said there just isn't. So the research that we did then in Buffalo from 66 to about 67 or 68 was groundbreaking research in adult literacy, and it was hailed as such. It was an incredible thing. There were 275 adult illiterates in our study, and the next 2 years, Bill Eller made sure that I had a variety of experiences in those Buffalo years. I taught some new something almost every semester. And it was that variety of experiences, including the major professor went to Colorado, and Bill needed somebody to head the Triple T, the training teachers of teachers, and so he said, Anabel. So I was head of Triple T. I was one of the doctoral students right along with the other 9, but we just had a wonderful time. And part of what we did was to then go down to inner city Buffalo and teach these youngsters who had all been dumped into one fourth grade classroom. And it's the experience that we had with that I included in the book. One of the things that stood out in my memory of that whole experience there was being in the classroom with adult new readers the night Martin Luther King was killed. And we'd become very close. These were all African American, and I can remember Joby Seals saying to me, well, Mrs. Newman, why does the white man hate us so? And I said, Joby, that's not anything I can answer, but we can go to the library together. And we all took hands and went to the library that night. The pity of that was when we got to the library, there were no books there for adult new readers. We couldn't find a single thing that was of any interest or that was of a reading level that could be useful to them. So that experience in Buffalo launched me on the work that I subsequently did in adult literacy. And when I left, when I graduated, and by that time Phil had also finished his PhD, when we were then asked to come to Bloomington to work in a special project, a big U.S. Office of Education project here in Bloomington. And because I'd had these research experiences both in Iowa and in Buffalo, it made that transition very simple for me. When Bill Eller called me from Buffalo and asked me to come, and he said, oh, and by the way, we're going to have a special month in August, but he didn't really describe very much about it. I got there on a night, we'll say a Sunday night, and we were starting this little workshop the next day. And the little workshop was with 5 states and a huge delegation from Puerto Rico. And I was the reading person. I had never had a stitch of experience in adult literacy. I was absolutely terrified, and everybody knew it. These were all people who were coming out of adult literacy. And dear Bill, Bill was awfully good at just tossing me into a situation and seeing whether or not I could swim. And that month was just a terrifying experience for me, but it helped me cut my teeth in the whole field of literacy. And by the end, these Puerto Ricans got a hat that was this big, and they all signed it for me. So I survived the month, but it was an experience like I never want to do again. The whole experience of being part of the Triple T program was an incredible one to me, because I didn't have any training for directing doctoral students, and here I was in charge of the Triple T. Well, it didn't become so much of a teaching experience as a learning experience, because we figured out ways of getting in. All of these, the other 8 or 9 in the program, were all people that wanted to work with disadvantaged children. And so we figured out ways of getting into the schools in Buffalo and actually doing it. And it was that kind of thing that Bill Eller made sure one summer, for example, he said, now, why don't you get a couple of adults and adult non-readers and work with them yourself? Bill never came to observe me. He'd ask occasionally how things were going. His whole philosophy was, get good people and get out of their way. And he had a respect for me, and so he'd put me into situations where I would have to grow. And I can remember his talking to me one time and saying, now, it's not enough to be cute and lovable. You're going to be a professional now. Another one of these wonderful men in my life, so to speak, was Roger Farr. Roger had also been at the University of Buffalo as a doctoral student, and he was a year or two ahead of me, came to Indiana University, and when they were working on the special U.S. $1 million grant that Leo Fay was in charge of, and they needed somebody for working with a development project for reading and language arts classes, and Roger recommended me. And it was again one of those experiences of somebody spotting something in you. Roger knew that I had functioned well when I'd been at Buffalo, and so when I came down here, I had lunch with 3 or 4 of the men in the faculty, and that was it. I hadn't even sent in my papers. So I subsequently sent in my papers, and Phil and I came down, found a place to live. And when I came, the summer of '71, I had gotten the degree in June, continued to teach in Buffalo, and came down here with the assurance that what I was needing, what I needed to work with these undergraduate classes was already developed. It wasn't already developed at all. It was 46 hours of raw video, which I was to edit that year. I was asked, did I know about development? And I had to ask the vice president or vice dean, anyway, the assistant dean, I had to ask him what he meant. And what do you mean by development? Well, have you, and I said, well, yeah, that's sort of what I do. And so here I am. I'm put into a situation where I was given 16 grad students. There were 40 faculty participating in this in one way or another. It was the most incredible experience. If I could go back, I would probably do a pretty good job now. But at that point, they'd given me classes that started at 7:30 in the morning. I had 90 students. I had 5 pieces of equipment in the room that I was to run. And, I was just breathless the whole semester. I did live through it, and they juggled things a little bit. And Jerry Harsty and I, the second year, went to Hunter School, and that was a very fine experience. It was so fine that they said, oh, good, the third year, now what you need to do is spread this out to other schools. And I said, it won't be the same. We can't do that. The reason this is so successful is that Harsty and I were there with those teachers and with those students all the time. I fleshed out one young man who was, he said, but my cousin is the mayor of Gary. And I said, I'm just so sorry, but this isn't for you. And so there were a couple of students that we had to say, this isn't for you. But the other 20 or 21, boy, did they turn out to be outstanding educators. 2 of them went on for doctorates, and they put me into one situation after another. After that development effort went on, and it became known as Project Relate, Reading, Language Arts, Teacher Education. And it was such a big project that even though Bell and Howell had been engaged to work with it, and they were going to publish it, but they found out we had 26 films. They said, we can't do anything this big. So we developed the manuals for it and the films, which are in the archives at IU. And I'm just as convinced as anything that if we ever could go through and pull out the nuggets of that, it would be a real boost to teacher education. I was asked to be director of the Reading Practicum Center, and that was what I did then for the next 20 years. And it was out of that experience that I had data, because we kept very careful records on the learners that we worked with. And at first I started just working with youngsters, but gradually we added so that by the time, maybe 6 or so years, we had data on all the way up through adult. And it was that when the opportunity came to be part of a really major research effort called Consult, which was with Dr. Edward Patrick and a marvelous man whose father had done major research for the Navy in the 40s. The son and Patrick were co-working on this project, which is a process of applying artificial intelligence and pattern recognition to data. And they have subsequently demonstrated with 100% accuracy that they can identify in the Shriner Hospital, for example, in Cincinnati, why children didn't make it. Now that sounds kind of negative, but by finding out why they didn't make it, they were able to suggest changes that should be made. Well, in the meantime, Patrick has gone on and applied this to a major bank in Paris, to geology, to farming, pharmaceuticals, Abbott, So we're the only educational institution, and it was simply I ran out of time that I wasn't able to go on with Consult. But if I have any regrets about my educational career, it's not going on with Consult. In 1980, a wonderful woman who was with the American Library Association by the name of Jean Coleman had been part of something we had done with the library here in Bloomington. Over the 70s, I had been working with the Library Association here, and we had developed what were called the Lit TV, Literacy Instructor Training Using Television, with Michael Perrer. Mike had been a 15-year video developer in Australia, came to work on his doctoral program here, and we became friends because we were both interested in adult literacy. And his hope was that he would be able to develop materials which he could take back to Australia, because he said the distances are so great and we need to have something that can be used for distance education. So together we did 5 films that subsequently we had to redo because they were all done in black and white, and the State Department had given us, I think, a $50,000 grant, and they wanted them, now they were so good, they wanted them in color. And we said, well, we can't do them. We can't just change black and white to color. But we redid them. And those films and videos were used then in the Vital program that we started in the mid-70s for about 20 or 25 years, and they were used nationally. Poor Michael couldn't take them to Australia because of some restriction with the AV department. And so, after all of our work, developing the manual and the films and the videos and so forth, Mike couldn't take them. So, we got to use them. Well, okay, through that development process, I met Jean Coleman, who was, I'm going to say she was the outreach person for the American Library Association. She was a beautiful, elegant black woman that came to be just such a close friend, just wonderful. And Jean asked if I would be willing to represent International Reading Association in a group that the American Library Association was putting together to be acting as a coalition for literacy. The American Library Association had wanted the Ad Council to do their program with the American Library Association. The Ad Council wouldn't do with just one organization like that. So they said, what you need to do is to pull together a group of literacy organizations. So the American Library Association spearheaded the collection of these 11 organizations, including the International Reading Association. Subsequent to that early 1980 effort, we figured that by the end of the 80s, we had millions of members represented. And the very special part of that experience was our experience at the White House. We were invited to Mrs. Bush, as in George Sr., took on literacy as her particular effort, and she was wonderful. At one point, on 4 different occasions, she invited us to come to the White House, and she would invite performers from Hollywood and so forth. So at one luncheon, there were 15 tables. I think it was in the East Room, but here are these beautiful big tables that are probably, I don't know, they're big. In the center would be a bouquet of 2 or 3 feet of roses, pink roses and pink carnations and white, just magnificent. And at those tables would be representatives from the White House, from their staff, from the media. So I was seated next to somebody from the New York Times, and at each table they had this mix. So it was quite a wonderful thing. Now, in the early, I think it was 1983, President Reagan had invited us, and so we had been there for his announcement of goals which the coalition had developed. But dear President Reagan, did he give us any credit? No, he announced them as his goals. Well, we said, after we had swallowed our pride, we said, well, what did we want? Did we want the country to know about those goals, or did we want to get credit for them? We decided we wanted the country to know about them, and who better to spread them than the president? Because we weren't getting any financial support, was almost impossible. But by this time, the Ad Council was doing their thing, and we'd started with a $50,000 grant from the Department of Education. Well, that's nothing for doing a national effort like that. By the time we finished, late 80s, we had information about adult awareness on the backs of books, and so we had newspapers, we had publishers. It was just an incredible, probably 10-year effort. During that same time, and we'd pass around the leadership of the organization among these groups. So for 2 years, I chaired the National Coalition for Literacy as the representative of the International Reading Association. During that same time, I was chair of a state Coalition for Literacy, and I was also invited to be in the dean's office as assistant dean. And it was Howard Mellinger, the dean, who allowed me, without, I mean, we didn't discuss this at all, but I had a full-time secretary who was supporting me in all of the efforts that I had to do for the coalition. You know, the minutes and the mailings and the conference calls, and I mean, it was a big deal. And Howard very kindly just let me plow ahead using a secretary that he was supplying. So I was very, very grateful both for what Mrs. Bush meant to the National and what Howard Mellinger meant here in the dean's office at IU. One of the kind of sweet things that happened one time was Mrs. Bush, and it was when we were all seated around these big round tables with the beautiful flowers, and Mrs. Bush said, well, now there's going to be somebody here for, coming in just a minute. And of course, it was Mr. Bush. So afterwards, we all got to have our pictures taken with the Bushes. And we would go through one by one. And when I was waiting my turn to go through, President Bush said, now are you alone? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, well, come here. And he put his arm around me, and I have the picture to prove it. So Mrs. Bush was the one that really did such a colossal job of making this all possible, both for the local literacy folk, people who were learning to read. We had one man, Ed Castor, who represented the state of Indiana, and another, I've forgotten her name, but they went on to then develop a program for adult new readers, the learners, a national program. So, it was a kind of incredible thing that was happening in the 80s, and it was the time when we had the Contact Literacy Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, fielded calls all over the country, and they would then match up the incoming calls from both people who wanted tutoring or people who wanted to be a tutor, and they would say, well, now call this number in your state and they'll be able to. So we went out to visit at one time because people weren't quite sure what to believe about this center. So a group of 4 or 5 of us went out to Omaha and found this incredible well, it was the second floor of an old junkyard. The director of this, Gary Hill, had taken all the second floor and had installed a bank of telephones from one end of this huge room to the other. So here were all these little folk sitting in these booths answering these calls, and Gary, on 2 occasions, had mortgaged his house so that he could keep this telephone contact literacy center going. So we had a pretty incredible bunch of people working with us during that whole effort of the 80s.